Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming back to the podcast. My special guest today is Mr. Matthew Whitman, who runs both a YouTube channel that's self-titled with his name and also the 10-minute Bible Hour podcast. Matthew, good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I found your channel on YouTube just exploring, learning about different faiths. And I found your channel and I found it very interesting because some of the stuff you've done, I've taken on to a much smaller level. And I thought it'd be interesting to have you come on and talk about one, what motivated you to start looking like that and how you've put your faith in action in your life.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So let's start from the beginning. Was faith something that you've come up with, or is it something that you've developed and grasped over time as you've gotten older?
Both and. I
Okay.
was raised in a Christian household. My dad was a first generation Christian and went all the way through to seminary and going through his own process of faith. So I was raised around that. I went to a Christian high school. Uh, I suppose I got, one of my degrees in undergrad was in biblical studies. So I've just been around it for a really long time. And over time, that kind of broke, I suppose. Maybe the world changed. Maybe I changed. Maybe some bad church experiences. Maybe having the whole thing rooted in kind of an epistemic certainty born out of my own logic and capacity to know things. I don't know. I consider myself to have had a faith build 1.0, and I ran that for a real long time. And then I went through almost a firmware update that
Okay.
lasted for a decent chunk of time after I'd already gone to seminary. And during that time, as much as I would have liked to have at the deepest level of my being believed that there was a God, the truth is I just didn't.
Hmm.
And it was kind of an odd feeling. But if atheism is thinking there's not a God or believing that there is not a God behind the origin of all things, then I was that for a time. And it wasn't like I was mad at anybody or
Hmm.
deconstructing. That would almost be anachronistic considering I went through that process before it was fashionable on the internet. It just kind of happened.
Right.
Some stuff happened, like the perfect little cocktail of life changes and more knowledge than my brain was ready to handle from seminary and reading the church fathers and philosophy and my own doubts and questions and shortcomings and pressure
Mhm.
of being around church, working at church. You add all of that up for, at least in my case, a guy in his late 20s, early 30s. And I yeah, I kind of had a little bit of a rough patch. And just one day I went to seek out God to contend with that. And I was like, I don't think there is one of those. When did that happen? This is really weird. And through a pretty lengthy process, the Faith Build 2.0 came along and kind of spread out all the messed up parts of Faith Build 1.0 and went through something of a process there. And I got to a place of saying, oh, wow, no, I really, as genuinely as I believed there was a God in the first place, as genuinely as I did not believe that for a time, I now genuinely, as an adult with my adult brain, have come to a place of believing there's a God and wanting to put my life and my energy into trying to figure out what it looks like to follow that God. And so that's why what was a simple question for you? Was I raised around it or this happened later? Well, really kind of both. I know exactly what it feels like to be someone who is of goodwill and fair-mindedness, who looks at the data, who looks at the world and doesn't think there's a God. I also know what it looks like to be someone who is that and looks at it all and says, I I think not only that there is a God behind this, but the God of Abraham, the God described in the Bible, the God who took on flesh in the person of Christ, is that singular God, the maker of all things. And I might not understand him completely or know all the things about him. I think wrong things about God even right now. I just don't know which ones are wrong. but
Right.
I believe that such a God um, exists.
Okay. Do you think that the things that you were going through, which is a story many people could echo, I know people myself that would maybe have that struggle early in their adulthood or maybe late teens or maybe even further along as in their life, that they may say some of the struggles they had obscured, God was there, but he was obscured to them. He was still there, but when they looked for him, maybe it wasn't the God they were looking for, or what they needed at the time. He didn't have those characteristics that they were looking for. But some people say, no, no, he absolutely was not there. Maybe it was a delusion. I ever believed in him in the first place. Which one would you say more aligns with what with your experience?
Hmm. I think that my experience lines up with a fissure in human history that is entirely unique and may not be duplicated again ever. I think something seismically broke between 1995 and 2008, 2010 in the West. There may be four, maybe five fissures in the history of all of Western civilization where a sea change occurred over the course of a generation or two in terms of our relationship with technology, its ability to extend the physical and intellectual power of the individual, where maybe our relationship with the abstract or with government changed, with violence changed, and um, and one just happened, and it happened right in front of all of our faces, and it happened at breakneck speed. And I don't think planet Earth, not just Christianity, not just the church, I don't think planet Earth was ready for what happens when you take everybody from every tradition and through the power of the internet, put them all in the exact same room and just see what happens.
Right.
There are the obvious implications that everybody talks about, like, well, the anxiety that comes with social media, or the economic implications of that, or the ability for bad actors to do things to mobilize vote or political change. But I think there's something more subtle that happened epistemologically in terms of how we know things, and that is that our power for the retention of knowledge got dramatically expanded very quickly. So we went from really needing to know things on the fly to theoretically knowing everything there is to know in the world simply by using the device that's in everybody's pocket. Well, it's not real knowledge, but it creates the impression of knowledge. Well, that
Right.
messes with people. It messes with an individual, with a culture. And then you tag onto that the fact that generally religiously people live in bubbles, and I'm not even sure that's the worst thing ever. There's a reason that religion and even faith within Christianity has evolved the way it has. It's because it's reflective of the environment and the history and the pressures that exist in any given people group. I mean, all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant, God indicated this was going to be for all the nations, and they were going to look different. The day of Pentecost is an affirmation that this was meant to go to all these different little pockets, and there would be all these different little expressions. Well, all of a sudden, you're in the same room with all these people, and they believe their theological convictions as hard as you believe yours, and they're not weird. They're not bad
Mm-hmm.
people. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems like they really mean it. And suddenly you realize that just sort of that heartfelt glurge stuff that I think a lot of different Christian expressions had been coasting on for generations in the West, suddenly that I just really feel it and really believe it thing, it didn't work the way it used to. It didn't have the same purchase. And I think as a kid who grew up in the 90s and went to college in the 90s and started adulthood in the early 2000s, for me, my faith, the moment where I go from kid faith to adult faith, happened right on that singularly unique fissure in all of human history. And that's why I think if you talk to older millennials, younger Gen Xers, you'll hear a lot of the same story as the one that I'm telling, because it was just an incredibly tumultuous time to try to do faith anyway, just because of our age.
Right.
And then you add to that what was going on in the world. And I still don't think we've figured out how to be in the same room together and process faith and belief in God together, even with 20, 25 years of trying it.
Right. Do you, having said all that, do you think ignorance can be bliss? And also, is there such a thing as too much knowledge?
There is definitely such a thing as too much knowledge, and it is where knowledge outstrips wisdom, or the capacity to hold all that knowledge in your mental cache. Robots and computers, your solid state drive, it can hold a lot of knowledge, but it can't synthesize that knowledge into wisdom and ethics. And that's one of the really unique characteristics of the human mind, the human soul being made in the image of God, is we have the ability to hold all of that data in our metaphorical solid state drive, to access it fairly quickly, and to synthesize it and contrast it into moral and ethical judgments, hopefully in keeping with the values of the kingdom of God. And if that knowledge outstrips our ability to synthesize it or think about it with some sort of wisdom as a complement, then yes, at that point it becomes too much knowledge, and we'll become Icarus. We'll become Jurassic Park. We won't ask whether or not we should. We'll just ask whether or not we could. And so I feel like, I mean, right now we're living in a moment where we do not have wisdom to match our cultural knowledge. And I feel like I'm one who can critique that because I know what it's like to have more knowledge than wisdom, and what that can do on an individual level. It's terrifying to think about what that could do on a global level. So yes, to the second part of your question, and I forgot to the first part of your question.
Is ignorance truly bliss?
Yes. Uh,
Or can it be, as a better way of saying that?
yeah, I like that question better. Yeah, depends on what you mean by bliss. I think there can be a contentedness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I hope it is, because we're all ignorant. Let me put it that way. I mean, these are both questions of degree, right? How blissful, how ignorant.
Right.
Well, I'm wildly ignorant. I I know the teeniest, tiniest fraction of a fraction of the things there are to know. I mean, I know a few broad patterns and a few basic facts, and I have some memories I think are reliable. I know nothing. So I hope that there is some degree of joy and bliss, contentedness, and not knowing stuff because of how much stuff I don't know. But um, I think it's very easy to be prideful in ways that are damaging to ourselves and others in society, and in a way that's very damaging to our connectedness with our maker, when we imagine that we know a lot more than we actually know.
Mm-hmm. I know, looking back, my grandparents' generation, great grandparents, fortunately, I knew all my grandparents, all my great grandparents on both sides of the family, and they were all either, well, I'm Church of Christ, so they were Church of Christ or Baptist, but you could apply this really to any multi generational faith. And you go back, 40, 50, 60 years ago and beyond, they had a much simpler life. They didn't, most of them didn't go around in normal conversations questioning their faith. And, well, gee, there's all these other options out there. I never thought about these before. They believed what they believed, wholeheartedly. They lived a relatively simplistic life compared to all the clutter we have in our lives. And they seemed to be more content and strong, very resolute in what they believed. I don't remember any of them questioning, is there another alternative? What about this? Gee, I looked up Google and it told me 50 different ways of reading one scripture. Have we made life too complicated, and have we caused all these problems with some of the challenges to our own faith?
Well, this is where that be still and know that I'm God
Mm-hmm.
principle comes in. We don't, I hate it when people use the royal we, but I think I actually mean it in this. Surely there's somebody listening to this conversation, reading this conversation, maybe in that form later on, who's actually pretty good at be still. I know it's a discipline that some people are great at. Most of us frantically move from one glowing screen to the next, and frantically move from one pursuit of the endorphins that come from those ones and zeros to the next. I think if you really strip down life and look at what motivates us and what we do, it's pretty gross. It's pretty ugly at this point. It's pretty dystopian at this point. for those people who maybe at one point in my life I would have mocked, to have the ability to be still, I think they cracked a code that the rest of us have lost touch with to our own detriment. So I do think there was a simplicity that the age of the internet has done damage to. I don't know how you reclaim that, but that simplicity, it's it's connected to a right standing, or I should say, not a right standing, an acknowledgement of who he is and what we are by comparison, that we're in the position of need. He's in the position to meet needs, and not the other way around. And identity is a big aspect of faith, a big aspect of relationships. And so I think about your folks going to a Church of Christ church. I don't know if it was in a small town or a big town, but I know they
Yes.
didn't have electric guitars or drums.
Oh no.
And they'd go in there and they'd sing their a cappella songs, and they'd listen to some Bible teaching, and maybe they'd keep each other accountable on a few of the rules. I know Church of Christ is a little more on that side of the slider in
Oh
terms
yes.
of concerns with that element. And then they would go out about their life for the week, and they would find their identity within a 3 mile radius. They would find their identity within their relationships with their neighbors, the people they regularly did business with, went to school with, did a little bit of leisure with, and went to church with. They didn't need to carve out some unique appearance or set of appreciations or affinities in a sea of 7 billion people who are all competing for their own sense of meaning in their own uniqueness. I mean, we could predict and easily did predict 20 years ago where that would take us. People would do increasingly damaging things to themselves, to their own bodies, simply in a misguided attempt to try to somehow carve out some unique real estate in a global community of billions. And I think what we're seeing, and I think what I feel the pressure of, is just this realization that we can run to the ends of the earth. We can do a bajillion things on the internet. We can get a bajillion views, but ultimately, it's no identity at all. It's fake. It's ones and zeros. It's everybody being their own brand manager instead of living in that little 3 mile community like maybe your
Mm-hmm.
ancestors did and mine
Mm-hmm.
did. You're out trying to make who you are work and work for you and come off just the way it needs to, given the breezes of social preferences at any given time. You're trying to do that in front of all of planet Earth and then pivot quick, constantly. It's disorienting. It's the opposite of identity or knowing who you are or where you fit or why you matter or why you have value. And it's the exact opposite of the gospel. The gospel answers that question quite simply. You're made in the image of God, and you have value because the one who made you has ultimate value and ordained that existence would happen in such a way where you would be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild. You
Mm-hmm.
have value because if you're in Christ, you are made a son, a daughter, an heir, an agent of his kingdom with an unconditional role in that kingdom, but also with opportunities and responsibilities to help build this truest, realest thing ever, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, no matter how small your world might seem in the age of social media. That's who we are. We're redeemed. We're made whole in Christ, and we realize part of it now, and we realize it fully later. It's unbelievably simple and clear and defined in this immutable, unchanging reality of who God is, as opposed to what you and I and everybody's scrambling around to do right now, which is try to answer the question of who are we and where do we fit and why do we have value and why should we be accepted in an ever-changing, utterly mutable, impossible to pin down dynamic world where we don't actually ever even meet each other or hang out in real space.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's wildly different right now in terms of how we live from how your parents, my parents lived back in the day.
But what seems to remain universal, whether it's generations beyond or in the past or our current generation, and I'm sure generations, if we're still around in hundreds, if not thousands of years, I don't imagine it changing any more than that. The universal question is that belonging you talked about. Why are we here? How do we fit in with our culture, our family, our community? Higher purposes and stuff like that. So that is the universal set of questions that seem to transcend time.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I find it really reassuring to go back and read the classics, even the pre-Christian classics, and see that all these people from all these different cultures are asking the same thing. I've been obsessed with Persia lately for a couple
Mm.
projects I'm working on, like really old school Persia, like the Medes and the Persians,
Oh yeah.
Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, that kind of stuff. Same questions, man. I mean, people were trying to chase down Ahura Mazda, the chief god of Zoroastrianism, trying to sort through the same thing. What is the point of our existence? What stability or identity do I have in this crazy thing? And I tell you that in my estimation, the one that gives the most crystal clear, meaningful, lasting answer to that question is historic Orthodox Christian faith.
Speaking of that, and some of your explorations into other belief systems, where did that interest come from? Did it sort of come out of, as you said earlier, that quest for putting these pieces together that was missing in your life, and that you've cobbled some of those pieces together, and you've moved forward, and you have your faith, a restored faith, if you will, or a new faith, however you want to put that. What led you to going out and talking to different people of different faiths?
Okay, I want to pass it off as I'm just a really nice guy who likes to listen to other people.
Right.
But come on, man, we've hung out for whatever, 23 minutes now,
Yep.
and I'm doing a lot of talking. No, I like
Mhm.
to talk. I like to work things through, and I'm as selfish as anybody. I, sure, I care about other people and I care about their ideas, but really, I wanted to go on a journey to try to work through this question. How can there be all these other threads of Christianity where equally well trained people who are equally sincere and thoughtful and equally willing to invest time and energy and equally self-critical, how can they look at the exact same data set, that being the Bible, 2000 years of church history, philosophy, the natural world? How can they look at the same thing and think that they should baptize their babies? Wait, what?
Hmm.
But what about this stuff in the New Testament? Like, how can that, but
Right.
I can't just write you off as crazy because
Yeah.
you're reasonable humans. I've looked closely enough to see that you make sense.
Right.
Um, I've just been hyper curious about that. And
Yeah.
then from there, I got really curious about, well, what happens when you add just a couple of points of mild deviation on a couple of ideas, and you turn two or three different expressions of Christian faith that would agree on all of the creedal foundational beliefs and hold the same holy scriptures? What happens when you turn them loose over 1,000-year period in different
Mhm.
parts of the world? Oh, fascinating. Look at the way these groups will hold to these foundational creedal biblical beliefs so that it's crystal clear we're all still talking about the exact same precisely named and described deity, but it looks different in terms of the art, in terms of the architecture, in terms of what the goal is for a normal attender to grow in as they attend this expression of faith versus this expression of faith. So my two areas of big interest are, one, I just want to work through the epistemological question, insecurity, maybe, if you will, of how can there be other people who I think are just as sincere as me and try just as hard as me, and they think something different looking at the same source material? And the second thing is taxonomy.
Mhm.
I'm just fascinated by this organism that I believe is alive in God, the maker of all things. And I'm fascinated by the diversity of it. And all of that points to me toward a God who is incredibly secure in his own skin. Right, to give this thing this much leeway, and apparently, and not coming back to judge it, correct it, kill it, knock it out, whatever. Apparently, by his forbearance, what's being communicated is, hey, I knew the church was going to have a lot of wrinkles to it. It's made of my followers. I knew this is what it was going to look like. But I feel like by doing this taxonomy stuff, I'm learning more about the character of God and his forbearance and his ability to use just flawed, busted up institutions and well-meaning attempts to accomplish things that are transcendent.
Hmm. What was the first church outside of your own faith system that you visited, and what were some of the things you noticed right off the bat that were similar to what you believed, and then obviously very different?
Yeah, the answer to that question is different between on video and off video. I've been around a lot of different expressions of Christianity over the course of my adult life. Um, yeah, just doing church stuff. So I suppose probably Pentecostalism
Okay.
was the first expression without a camera that I went and experienced, and it ate at me because I looked at a lot of it and I was there. I was sincere, but I would hear the claims of the miraculous. This is in the pre-internet age, before
Hmm.
everybody could point a camera at it. Uh, I would just my five senses I didn't think were lying to me. I just look at it and said, "But I don't think the thing you just said happened."
Right.
I think I could verify that empirically. In fact, I'm sure I could verify that the thing you just said happened did not actually happen. And so that troubled me, but it stuck in my craw because as much as I had a problem with that, and I'll be honest, I still do have a problem with it when
Right.
people say things that are materially demonstrable happened in church and then they didn't happen. But it stuck in my craw because these same people were so enthusiastic to go and tell other people about life in Christ. And so I couldn't just write off the Pentecostals as being crazy or bad or whatever when they were willing to go out and make the effort with people who couldn't do anything for them in ways that I wasn't. And then after that, I got to know Catholicism a lot better and Orthodoxy kind of at about the same time. Um, there are a lot of reasons that I'm not Catholic or Orthodox, but there are a ton of reasons that I would be too. I mean,
Right.
first and foremost, that we name the exact same deity, that we recite the exact same creeds every single Sunday. Really, probably the starting point of the biggest differences is I get to know those two groups better. It's just a question of church authority. I would rank the Bible higher, and I would rank the institution and the church hierarchy. I wouldn't write it off. I would just rank it lower.
Right.
And it's, I mean, that's one of the things that I've observed in talking with all these people is it really often just comes down to a question of authority more than even theology, just authority first. How do you rank it out? How do you think God would build his church? How do you think God would build the body? Would he do it through his revealed word? Is that how he would pass along to future generations what was handed down to him? Would he do it through the indwelling of his Holy Spirit on a broad basis, or would he do it through an institution that isn't perfect, but the institution covers over some of the blemishes and clumsiness and lapses that you might get from the individuals? Or would he do it through modern prophecy and modern apostles who receive new revelations, which I'm a little skeptical of? But that question of authority seems to be where so much of it breaks. I felt like it was a lot easier to be empathetic and just say, you answered that question differently than me. And now we're going to have an easier time connecting and getting into the nuts and bolts without getting after each other.
Hmm. I know myself what got me kind of going that path, exploring some of the different faiths. When I don't do any of this, I actually teach Irish dancing, like the river dance stuff. I teach that
Cool.
and have for a long time. And a lot of my students are naturally Catholic, not just Irish, but a lot of them are Northern European in descent. And so I thought, it'd be really interesting to know what makes my dancers tick. And
Mm-hmm.
because they would come in, and some of the ones I would teach to be more of the traditional side of the Catholic faith. There's, you study this, so I know, there's like a contemporary side, and there's the more the traditional, like the
Sure.
SSPX and stuff like that. And they're all great people, very good people. And I was curious why there were differences between the two. And so I visited their church. And then later on, I would visit what I called more the contemporary, like the Catholic churches you see on the corners, the bigger ones. And I thought, okay, I don't really see a difference. And then one of them said, well, do you notice which way the priest faces? And I thought,
Mm.
oh, yeah, okay. They do face the others a different orientation. They said, well, for us meaning the traditional side, for us, the priest is, and my trad cath folks, don't be mad at me if I get this a little wrong, but I'm trying here. They would say, in our church, the priest basically directs the audience to God, and the other ones basically in the sense of how they're facing each other. They would face the tabernacle and the and the shrine and stuff in the back, and it's like they're carrying you to God. where in the contemporary Catholic sphere, the priest is facing the audience like I would be used to in the Church of Christ or really any other church. And they said, well, that's their view is they're kind of taking God and directing him to the audience. So I was like, no, I never thought of it
Mm.
like that. I may be getting that a little bit wrong, but I think that was like the gist of why he's facing certain directions, and how
Hmm.
who's being presented to who. Uh, have you had that experience? Have you visited the different aspects of the Catholic Church?
Yeah. Yep. I had church services over the last 10 years or so. I like thinking about those things. Stuff means stuff. Anybody could ever claim credit for coining. That was my distillation of my uh, hermeneutics and my semiotics courses in undergrad and grad school was, okay, so the point of all of these classes is stuff means stuff. Everything has meaning. Cultural texts have meaning. And it is a human cultural text as to which direction the priest faces. It isn't an accident. It does mean stuff. I might not interpret it the same way that those folks you spoke with would, but it means something and it
Mhm.
matters. And there's so many little wrinkles in a church building, in the way a priest conducts himself, in the lyrics of the songs that they sing, in the order of the service, in the way the building's laid out. All of that stuff means something. And so it makes making these videos where I go and visit churches and get a tour and talk theology. I mean, if I've got an even kind of interested dance partner giving me the tour, it's really easy to just act like I'm 5 years old, and then point at things and be like, how come that's blue?
Right.
How come there's a banner right there? Why come you got a railing right there? How
Hmm.
come the stained glass windows have pictures of flowers? And that's it. Sometimes I know the answer. Sometimes they don't know the answer. Sometimes I think maybe they make stuff up. But um, I find that to be super empathy building to
Hmm.
listen to people explain why it looks the way it does and why they do it the way they do it. And so my job's really, really easy. Just ask people to tell me why their thing, why their expression of Christian faith is beautiful. Who doesn't want to
Right.
talk about that, right?
No, that's true. So Catholic aside, I know you've also visited some of the Orthodox churches, and what were your thoughts of them?
Uh, Same. I don't share the comprehensive system of theological thought, but I get it and I respect it, and it makes it really easy for me to not even just empathize with, but appreciate that these would be the natural rhythms of an Orthodox service, an Orthodox community.
Hmm.
And I particularly get, given what we were talking about this moment in history in terms of
Right.
how we think about truth and knowledge and all of this stuff, I get why the more content to declare something a theological mystery wherein we trust God, I understand why that would be very appealing to a whole lot of people who were raised around Christianity in the same era I was right now. And I think everybody should be very grateful to the Orthodox, and I would say to the Anglicans as well, maybe to some extent the Catholics, but I think particularly the Anglicans and the Orthodox for kind of swooping in for this little micro generation, this batch of people who were still raised on 90s youth group, but then immediately got sent out of that into this fissure in the history of thought and faith and planet Earth. Those two groups in the United States and Canada, the English speaking world, I think have done a good job of coming along and saying, hey, here's something that is old, that has strong liturgical emphasis, and that might help you kind of batten down the hatches for a minute while you work through some of these difficult things that you're just going to have to work through. So I've really appreciated my connections within Orthodoxy. The priests I've met have been great. I will say this: there's in my experience, a deep-seated historical pain within Orthodoxy, probably having to do with geography and the fact that Orthodoxy historically has existed on the fissure, the contested area between two cultures. I think the Orthodox sometimes feel like they took a whole lot of bullets for the West, and I think they might have a point, and that can bleed through even in a service. I've had some rough experiences in Orthodox churches with really very little tolerance for anything other than cultural orthodoxy. And I think I can give people grace for that, but that's something people should know before they walk in the door. I think that element is there. It's a unique historical Christian tradition in terms of what they've been through.
Interesting. So what church do you go to now?
I'm at a Free Lutheran church.
Okay.
Historically, I went to the Evangelical Free Church of America's private liberal arts college for undergrad. And then I went to that same seminary, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, for grad school. And then post grad, I did it a public institution in Nebraska.
Okay.
Um, and so, yeah, I did my credentialing and everything and was a pastor for a long time in the Evangelical Free Church. Evangelical Lutheran, I've only ever been to one. I just really like the guy who runs this one. I appreciate the added emphasis on liturgy and the heavy emphasis on careful teaching of Scripture and a real emphasis on pietism's not quite the right tradition to point it to, but maybe sort of that Germanic pietism that, hey, something about this should promote the fruits of the Spirit and the people who hear it and practice it. And you should want to give away the things that God is building into you in terms of his values and his character out in the bigger, larger world. And so I think that's kind of how we ended up landing in that tradition. I do think that one of the risks of the theological systems that put more emphasis on the authority of the church as a mediator is that reverence can choke out that personal holiness aspect. And I think the personal holiness aspect and independent thought in churches like where you and I have gone can choke out the reverence aspect. I don't know who's got the market cornered on putting those in proper balance before God yet.
Hmm. Ecumenicism. What do you think about that? Do you think that there's ever a possibility of churches finding enough common ground to reassimilate, if you will? Because we
I
all
would
know
hope.
that the church attendance, it doesn't matter what what congregation or tradition you follow, is for the most part decreasing. And people have
See,
said, well, on
is
common
that
issues,
true?
we should unite.
Yeah.
For social issues. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Well, until like the last week, I would have just, without even thinking, agreed with you. The Evangelical Free Church, I have been told, the numbers I've looked at have said that through the 90s and the first half of the 2000s, basically everything before the YouTube era, YouTube and MySpace, that seems to be the historical cutoff
Okay.
culturally. Up until that point, the Evangelical Free Church of America and the AG, Assemblies of God,
Hmm.
those were the two churches that were slaying it. Crazy growth.
Hmm.
And as I understand it, EFCA plateaued out. And I think Evangelical Free Church made a lot of sense because it's not Pentecostal. It's pretty big tent, but very much into the life of the mind. Um, kind of a good fit for that sort of libertarian, pluralistic. Hey, we know we're not going to be a theocracy and we don't get to dictate everything to you, but public morality is still important. It kind of fit with that Western classical liberal vibe pretty well. As times have shifted, I can see why it would plateau given that. But I've been seeing numbers in the last couple of weeks indicating that over the last 10, 20, and 30 years, evangelical church attendance is still on the rise. I think
Hmm.
everybody agrees that mainline church attendance is absolutely cratering, just
Right.
absolutely cratering. And if we step back from our own beliefs and just look at that from a very strategic point of view, it would appear that if the values of the church look exactly like what is popular in society, there isn't a reason to attend that church because you don't really need God to sign off on it. Society's already signed off on it.
Hmm.
My understanding from the numbers I just saw is that Catholicism in America, a regular attendance that is down, and that within Orthodoxy, it's maybe angling up slightly, and Anglicanism angling up slightly. Again, I just saw these numbers. They were really
Interesting.
counterintuitive to me,
Yeah.
kind of blew my mind. I'm still researching them and trying to figure out if this is even true. So I just want to throw out that caveat. Maybe our assumptions are mistaken on that. I'm revisiting all of that right now.
Hmm. I know even within the Church of Christ tradition, you've got there's three within earshot of where I live right now. There's one across the street, my home church, probably 10 miles away, and then there's another one probably 6 miles away.
Okay.
The one I grew up in and the one across the street would be considered moderate to conservative. The one down the road by those of us in this church tradition would consider it liberal, as we would
Okay.
understand liberalism to be. But that church, it's rare to find an empty seat. In our churches, there's plenty of empty seats. Do you see that trend yourself with things going that direction with across some of the traditions that you follow?
This is what I'm seeing right now.
Hmm.
The the more fundamentalist the church, the more they're struggling right now. But there are two types of fundamentalism. There is incredibly conservative, rule oriented fundamentalism, like what we generally think of when we hear the term. I'm not saying that's what your church is. I don't know
No,
what
I
your church
agree.
is.
I understand.
Just gave me a vague explanation. But then there's leftist fundamentalism.
Hmm.
And I don't mean liberal when I say leftist. I mean wantonly progressive leftist, the far, far end of the political distribution. Um, both of these groups have a behavioral orthodoxy that is made very explicitly and implicitly clear. You're allowed to violate it maybe once, but beyond that, there's not a lot of a mechanism for forgiveness and atonement. You wear that scarlet A in either of these traditions that are at the far end of the distribution, out at the ends of fundamentalism. And modern leftism has all of the characteristics of a religion with an orthodoxy, with expectations for its adherents. And regardless of what I think about each of those principles or not, I think that's a fair and defensible statement. And fundamentalists don't like dissent. Well, that's not very popular right now, because right now people are agitated and uncomfortable. And at least for the last 10 years, I think have pined for the ability to accommodate a little bit of dissent and a little bit of wrestling. What I think you're going to see happen in the next 1 to 5 years is things that are traditional and simply transcend the arguments, I think are going to do really well. Stuff that is largely in opposition to modern ethics and modern leftist assumptions, but that doesn't make it the center point of what they do. I think that's the stuff that's going to get on a rocket ship. I think that's the stuff that's going to be attractive. The churches where the pressures from the political left don't live rent free in their head. We're the church. We don't move. We've been here for 2,000 years. We've been doing these kind of liturgies. We've been saying these creeds. We've believed this thing. These trends will ebb and flow and come and go. You might persecute us. We're used to it. It happens in every culture. It's going to happen in this culture too. Fine. We'll just faithfully move ahead with this. I think that's what's going to be really attractive to people, and where a lot of outsiders coming to faith for the first time and insiders relocating are going to end up. And I can't say what tradition that is,
Right.
but within any tradition that does that, I think that's where it's going to be at for the next chunk of time.
Hmm. And there is something to be said. I know you've experienced this and you've learned about this yourself, that when someone stridently views a certain perspective and that is the way for them and that's their tradition, that's what makes life make sense, that ritual, those people hunker down. When their faith is threatened, their way of belief is threatened, they become more ardent in their beliefs and not less.
Mm-hmm. And I think people want to do that more ardent in their beliefs defiantly as opposed to aggressively. I Whatever one makes of Donald Trump and people who do sort of rightist, sort of conservative-ish, vaguely pseudo-Christian politics in that style, that just blunt force bull in a china shop, fight fire with fire. You
Hmm.
use the tricks of the devil for the devil. Well, we're going to use the tricks of the devil for God. It, I don't think people feel good about it. I think they feel kind of icky about it. And it's not a 1 or a 0 with Donald Trump and that kind of strategy. Everything has pluses and minuses and goods and bads. I'm just not willing to write anybody off for who they vote for. But I think the church flirted with it and tried out getting power in that way. And I don't think it felt good for most Christians. And at the same time, I don't think most Christians want to run into the arms of things that are overtly and directly anti-biblical either. I think people want to connect with God and
Right.
make sense of their relationships and the things that feel wrong about our past and our soul and the things that we can't go back and change that we screwed up in our life. I think people want a mechanism for atonement and forgiveness. And you don't get that with fundamentalist leftism or fundamentalist rightism. You don't get that with power conservative politics. You certainly don't get it with power leftist politics. And the crazy thing is, this is like the church's superpower. This is the thing that we have to give to the world. No one else offers any kind of theological mechanism for meaningful, lasting atonement and right standing with God and others. But by the work of Christ on the cross, the church has that in unlimited abundance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think any church that leans into that and puts that front and center is going to connect with a lot of people.
We talked about some of the banes of technology and how it's caused a lot of problem and dissension, but clearly we could acknowledge the fact that it's helped a lot of people as well. It's connecting people in ways that we would have never connected, like you and I are right now. That leads into a little bit of a discussion about your YouTube efforts and in your podcast. So we've established the fact that you have these two methods of communicating your experiences, but how has the feedback been with both of your efforts? What are you hearing back from people, not just the people you visit, but the people who frequent your channel?
Yeah, on the YouTube side, where I go around and I visit a lot of other churches, I get almost no one who would say, this is really encouraging to see all these other churches. We should just put them all back together. And we should all just believe all the Christian things at once. We should have a reconciliation ceremony and just patch it up. Nobody's saying that. I think we're all at a point where we're past the initial shock and awe of the internet and seeing how everybody does it. And we're realizing that maybe even providentially, there's a reason that all of these different expressions of church exists. And it's not just because of historical pressures, it's because they're all good at something and nobody's good at everything. Every single group I visited, if you took them out of the Christian family tree, you lose something that nobody else could replace quite right or quite as well, because no one is positioned to do everything and be everything. It just isn't how people or institutions work. Only Nixon could go to China. It's just positioning. We understand this principle. And so all of these churches are really good at something, uniquely good at something. Also, all of them have pretty glaring weaknesses.
Right.
I have not seen an invincible church tradition that just does everything great. There's an other side to the coin of all of our attempts to systematize out theology and God. And our attempts are going to be insufficient. And therefore, we're going to paint ourselves into at least one little corner with each and every tradition where we can make it a point of emphasis, but we're just not built to do this particular thing very well. But you know who is? Those people down the street who we disagree with about baptism or sign gifts or women in ministry or whatever. They're good at this thing. We're not good at this thing. So
right.
We kind of need both. So I'm not running into anybody who's just beating down my doors from gazillions of comments on gazillions of views. Nobody's coming to me and saying, we need to put the whole thing back together. I haven't seen probably one serious comment suggesting that. I think everybody is coming to appreciate more that God has superintended this family tree in a really beautiful way. Now, there's some Orthodox and there's some Catholics I hear from who are like, everything else is heresy.
Right.
Come back home to the one true church, or you will burn in hell. I get that one a lot from those two high church traditions. And I get it. And people say stupid stuff from all traditions. So you can just forget that previous comment.
Right.
It's not representative of anything. What I am seeing, though, is that appreciation for other expressions of Christianity and more of a willingness to acknowledge that the creedal Christian historical Orthodox family tree is maybe a touch bigger than people thought. I'm also seeing that these pressures are forcing us to think about what the boundary markers are. If somebody can't say the creeds, are they practicing Christianity or are they practicing another religion? Now, that is not me saying if somebody can't say the creeds, that means God won't save them. I'm not in charge of that. Good
Mhm.
golly, there's going to be all kinds of people who are redeemed by God who got hired at the last hour who I didn't see coming, and I would have got it wrong if it were up to me.
Right.
God will redeem whoever God will redeem, and I'm not pulling that ladder up.
Mhm.
I want the same grace I've received for anybody, however God can work it out in his
Yeah.
sovereignty. Dump grace on everybody, God. I pray for it and I want it. But taxonomically speaking, Mormonism isn't Christianity. It's a different religion. Does that mean Mormons are bad and wrong? I don't want to pick a fight with Mormons. I like Mormons.
Right. Some of the
But
nicest people you'll meet.
taxonomically,
Yeah.
taxonomically, it's different. I mean, we share so many values, but they have a different understanding of who Christ is. They have a
Right.
different understanding of who God is. They have a completely other set of scriptures. It's,
Mhm.
I mean, they have different expectations of behavioral standards and other social elements. It's, I don't think it needs to be threatening to acknowledge that that is taxonomically distinct. It is Christian adjacent, and taxonomically there is clear overlap to be appreciated and enjoyed. Maybe even at times you can find common cause,
Mhm.
but it's not taxonomically identical. I would say that Jehovah's Witnesses are further afield in a different direction, Christian adjacent, some historical overlap, but just such disparate views that taxonomically it has to be acknowledged that is a different animal. And I think that's been really interesting to watch my audience from all of these diverse backgrounds kind of crowdsource that and think through, okay, well, as a Mormon, where do I fit into all of this? How does
Right.
it work as a Catholic? What do I do with the Presbyterians and so on and so forth? And ultimately, there's no way to talk about this without offending people, and offending is not my intent at all.
Sure.
But to be practical minded about it, well, that's what I'm seeing from my audience. People being willing to think in a practical way about something that historically maybe that's been a not the way you think about it.
Right. I have seen, and I'll get your opinion to see if you have seen or heard the same sentiment, but visiting the more contemporary Catholic Church, the bigger mainstream version of it, I know I hear a lot of comments in there by priests that say, our brothers and sisters on the other side of the aisle, our fellow believers, so it seems like there's I'm not going to put words in their mouth and say they're accepting of all the rest of us, but if you would, if you're going to acknowledge that whether it's their church or any other church that's different than yours, that acknowledges you as our other brothers and sisters, the other Christians, isn't that basically saying we're accepting everyone? Not everyone. I would say everyone in the sense maybe Trinitarian believer type Christians, mainstream, if
Historical
you will.
creedal Orthodox.
Yeah, yeah. I hear
Yeah,
that more and more now.
I do too. And within Catholicism, there's a divide on this. And obviously, I hear from
Right.
people who I would consider to be my brothers and sisters, who consider me to be, in the language of the Council of Trent from the mid 16th century, anathema. I
Hmm.
am
Hmm.
I am excommunicado.
Right.
I'm not a part of the family of God according to their understanding and where they kind of hit pause in terms of their historical theological development. Um, but Vatican II Catholics would call me a separated brethren and would, upon being pressed, gently and lovingly say that my wrong ideas can be worked out over a period of time in purgatory to be determined by God, a
Right.
place that I think doesn't exist and
Right.
that biblically I don't see a rationale for. And you still hear some of the latter. You'll still hear it in more fundamentalist Protestant groups as well, saying, Catholicism's a cult, or the Orthodox aren't Christians, or I don't know. It just gets really tricky when you start drawing the lines about who professes Christ and will be a recipient of God's judgment and who professes Christ and will be a recipient of God's mercy. That's an intimidating endeavor for me, and I'm just confident I'll get it wrong. But I'm really with the people who you just described, whose approach would be more to say, God will do the judging of souls and we'll sort all of that stuff out. Um, and in the meantime, people who name Christ as the Son of God, God in the flesh, I don't know, that's a brother, that's a sister,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah. So two separate conversations. One
Yep.
is something that belongs entirely to God. The other one is something that I think we as humans can't help but do, which is order things and organize and taxonomize and figure out
Mhm.
what is a part of which thing. But I'm actually really encouraged by what I've seen on the internet. I've talked about church unity in a non-centralized form for a long time. I've talked about opening the word together as a gesture of church unity. I've talked about celebrating baptism, even in different contexts. Some people are going to baptize their kids. Some people are not going to do that. Some people are going to dunk them. Some people are going to sprinkle them.
Mhm.
I mean, there's stuff to be celebrated in all of this. I've also talked about praying together and sharing communion together. And that one is the one where people get mad. Like,
Mhm.
no, I will not take communion with someone who thinks the wrong way about communion, but I will.
Mhm.
I will. If I take communion with people who think five different things about communion, probably somebody's wrong. Maybe it's me. But
Right.
to the best of our conviction and our understanding, all of us are there trying to partake in the meal that Christ initiated, that at the worst, at the least, is a remembrance of his actual body actually broken and his actual blood actual shed for the forgiveness of sin. And maybe at the most is somehow an invisible transformation into those elements, even when you consume it today. I mean, those are both pretty good.
Mhm.
And so I understand why people get hung up on that one, but pray together, celebrate baptism, open the word together, and find a way to take communion within the boundaries of your own convictions with people who are coming at Christian faith differently than you. I've run into a lot of people who are up for that and who've been willing to do that with me. And that's been incredibly encouraging to see how much goodwill out there is for, to put it, let me put it this way. There's a lot of people I've met out there who are willing to admit they might not be right about all the things, but they're trying dang hard to understand it. And in the meantime, they're willing to extend intellectual, theological grace to other people who name Christ and really want to get it right and follow God and read the Bible and do what it says and be a part of Christ's church and be a son, a daughter, and heir and agent of the kingdom. And that's probably been the most encouraging thing that's happened to me in the era of the internet in my life is just seeing that impulse toward Christian unity.
So day jobs, when you're not producing YouTube and podcasts on your separate podcast website there, is this all you do, or do you have a day job that you do? And you kind of, how do you balance the two out if you do say, oh, you don't do two different things? Okay.
That's what I do. Yeah, I have another
This is your
podcast
thing.
with my
Okay.
buddy Destin, who has a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. Our podcast is called No Dumb Questions. I'm a philosophy theology guy. He's a rocket scientist. We pick a topic, he rocket sciences it. I philosophy history it. We make some fart jokes. People seem to like it. So I do that. And then I do this daily deep dive Bible podcast called the 10-Minute Bible Hour, where literally all it is we pick a book of the Bible and we do about 10 minutes a day of content on it, kind of a drive time radio style, not telling people what to do or how to think, acknowledging multiple perspectives on it, trying to really do the history, narrative, context kind of stuff, and just make it fun for normal people who use normal words to dive deeply into the Bible to make it part of their daily rhythm. So between those two podcasts and the YouTube channel, it keeps me pretty busy.
And so for people who've contemplated doing the same thing, and I know many have, I mean, I've thought about it myself. Is it surely it's not easy or everyone would be doing it, but talk briefly, Matt, about the struggles with trying to make this your career because you've got bottom lines and budgets and
Yeah.
lifestyles and everything else, and you're not going to get rich overnight doing this. So
Uh, it's it's a pretty narrow window to make it work. It's in the 90s, remember everybody was in a band,
Right.
and now everybody has a podcast, and that's great. It's easier to distribute your work now than it was when everybody was in a band in the 90s. But the reality is there is a ton of content, and making things of quality that provide value to the audience is really only the first step. Things don't go viral like they used to go viral, and something going viral is no guarantee now of future success. It's just not the way it used to be. And especially post COVID, it's a pretty big grind to try to make something like this happen from scratch. And so I guess what I would say to people who want to do it is just get ready for a really serious grind. And if you're really passionate about taking on a project and working through a series of ideas or really chipping away at a given thing, and you've got the time and energy and money to grind, then give it a go. And if not, maybe wait till another moment in life, or maybe you do have those things in spades, and then give it a go.
Are you still exploring churches, or you've kind of come to a conclusion, at least for now? Or if you are, what's coming next?
Yeah, it's not even about coming to a conclusion. I learn something new every
Okay.
time. I'm not looking for the one true expression of Christianity, and there it's settled. It was this church in Overland Park, Kansas. They're the one who was right. Everyone should just move here and go to this. No, of course I resonate with certain churches more than others. Going to churches and having good conversations and seeing the best of what God is doing in that congregation and that tradition again and again and again is the opposite of what stupid church fights and dumb church stuff on the internet does to the soul. That stuff kills me. I feel atheistic impulses when I see the worst of Christianity in others and in myself. And my job makes it so that I get to go around and see the best of it in places that don't get celebrated oftentimes, stuff you'd never, ever hear about. These are people who aren't out trying to get a following, or they're just doing local church and doing it
Right.
really, really well, even if it's in a tradition that I don't particularly resonate with. Who cares? I mean, I said Overland Park, Kansas. I don't know why, but like, I don't live in Overland Park, Kansas. I can't go minister to the people there. We need a church to be there, and we need somebody to do that. And it's okay if they're not me, because it can't be me. So it has to be somebody else. So why wouldn't I want to root for them and even get some of the wind in my sails and the encouragement of seeing what they're doing and hearing their ideas and hearing about kingdom wins? I think we're in the middle of a despair campaign, man. I don't know if it's intentional. Increasingly, I think it probably is intentional. But there's a despair campaign going on to make all of us feel awful about everything all the time, and hopeless and angry at our neighbors and angry at people who we have 99.99% of stuff in common with, who should be our brothers and sisters in arms. But somebody somewhere must be spending unbelievable amounts of money to tap into our darker impulses to make us hate people who should be our friends. I'm just freaking sick of it, dude, especially within the church. I'm renouncing my imagined right to control everybody's beliefs and be the decider of what is the final verdict on Christianity. I just want the wins, man. I want to make friends. I want to have allies, and I am confident in the power and sovereignty of God to sort everything out from our disagreements. It's going to be just fine. I have long since forfeited my imagined right to kind of put my finger on the scale when I make a video and try to get people to go to this church, but not so much this one. If they see the gospel and they encounter the God of Abraham, the one true God of creation, in any of these churches I visit, awesome. Go do it. I'm not the decider. And whether anybody ever does that or not, I feel like for me, it is almost a spiritual discipline to go around and be encouraged by people in whom the Holy Spirit dwells, people who've been prompted to go and do kingdom stuff in ways they get no credit for, and to let them pastor me a little bit, speak into my life, pray for me, tell me their best ideas, show me their wins, let me celebrate those wins with them, and high five and have a laugh, and even a fruitful conversation about the stuff we disagree about, because it's just interesting, and then get on with it. And
Right.
so, no, I kind of never want to stop doing this thing where I go to churches and make these kind of videos, whether, they get a whole bunch of views like some of them do, or fewer like some of them do. I just find it so valuable. And I find it to be the antithesis of that despair campaign. I find hope in it.
Well, Matthew, we could probably go on for hours talking about different things, but I certainly appreciate your perspective, and talked to you a little bit before about before the interview about maybe having you come back and do a little follow up with some other topics. But thanks for coming on and sharing your perspectives.
Thanks, man. And thanks for letting me land the plane with a little bit of passion and excitement about there's something good for once. I'm really hopeful about where the church and about where all of this is headed.